October 14th, 1839. Wilkinson County, Georgia. 5 men marched into the Ojai River bottomlands, hunting a girl. Only one returned, delirious, arms carved with strange symbols, muttering to himself in the dirt. 4 never came back. Whispers among Creek elders say those scratches weren't random. They were a warning. The hunted can become the hunter. For over a century, descendants of those men refused to speak of that day, or the girl, or the forest that swallowed them whole. Today, we step into that swamp where a 15-year-old girl outsmarted 5 armed men, and the land itself became her ally. If dark history, hidden tragedies, and chilling survival stories call to you, welcome to Haunted Corridor. Besiditu bi ajididu. Court documents from Wilkinson County, Georgia, mention 5 plantation overseers sent into the Ojai River bottomlands on October 14th, 1839. Only one returned, half delirious, unable to speak coherently for nearly a month. The other 4 simply vanished. Officials wrote it off as swamp hazards, but eyewitnesses told a different story. The survivors' arms were covered in deliberate scratches, arranged in symbols no one could decipher. Except, according to Creek elders, they meant one thing: the hunted can become the hunter. Even more unsettling, the original incident report disappeared from county archives 8 years later, as if someone wanted the truth erased. Yet fragments survive in estate ledgers, misfiled depositions, enough to reveal a story far darker than simple misfortune, a story that should terrify anyone who thinks numbers, weapons, and brute strength guarantee survival. Because what happened in those bottomlands wasn't just a chase, it was a lesson in humility. An introduction to a world where knowledge of the land outweighed rifles, and where a 15-year-old girl, considered property by the men who pursued her, held every advantage they couldn't imagine. Before we continue, if stories of hidden histories, dark mysteries, and buried tragedies fascinate you, subscribe to Haunted Corridor and turn on notifications. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's step into the Ojai bottomlands, a place where 5 armed men learned too late that they were the ones being studied, not the other way around. The Ojai River bottomlands were no ordinary forest. They were a living labyrinth, a place where paths shifted overnight. Cypress trees grew so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground, and the smell of moss and decay clung to everything. Travelers whispered that the swamp swallowed voices, distorted direction, and erased footprints as if it had a mind of its own. Adjacent to this unforgiving wilderness sat the Gresham Plantation, 400 acres of struggling cotton fields managed by a man who had failed everywhere else, Thomas Gresham. He hired 5 overseers, men whose cruelty was legendary, men who believed authority came from violence, not understanding. Men who thought the forest would bend to their will. But the swamp had other plans. Floodwaters shifted channels constantly, turning once solid paths into muddy traps, and every hollow tree, every thick tangle of roots, became a secret advantage for anyone who truly knew the land. Hidden water trails, dry patches in flooded ground, the sounds of wind and birds, all these were lessons that only those who belonged to the swamp could read. Even before the hunt began, the Ojai bottomlands were already preparing the men for failure. A single wrong step could mean exhaustion, a leg swallowed by mud or disorientation in the ever-changing terrain, and the land itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as if aware of what was coming. For the men chasing Celia, the swamp was unfamiliar, hostile, and unforgiving. For her, it was a home, a library of survival lessons passed down from her mother, and a weapon she could wield with deadly precision. Every bend in the trail, every hidden ditch, every cluster of cypress roots was part of a map she had memorized, a map the men couldn't hope to understand. Not yet. As we move deeper into the story, remember this: the Ojai bottomlands weren't just scenery. They were a character in their own right, patient, observant, and quietly aligned with Celia, ready to show that in this forest, knowledge always trumps brute force. Next, we'll meet the men who thought they controlled the hunt, and see just how badly they underestimated her. Macabre, with the 5 men sent into the Ojai bottomlands, were no ordinary laborers. They were overseers, handpicked for cruelty, for their ability to dominate the enslaved, men whose reputations for violence were whispered across plantations. and whose confidence in their own power bordered on arrogance. At the head was Jacob Yarrow, meticulous, calculating, a man who treated punishment like an accountant treated ledgers, always measuring exactly how much suffering a person could endure before breaking. His younger brother Samuel was equally ruthless, carrying his own shadow of brutality. The others, Nathaniel Cruz, William Tyson, and Henry Burke, were men drawn to violence, men who believed that fear and force guaranteed control, that a girl could never outwit them, and certainly never survive where they could not. Yet they were about to learn that confidence is fragile when you walk into terrain you do not understand. Each step into the swamp stripped away the illusion of authority. The soil under their boots was unfamiliar, the air thick with unseen dangers, and the swamp itself seemed to shift around them, testing their every move. They believed the girl they chased, Celia, would tire, that fear would slow her down, that her youth and size made her an easy target. They could not have been more wrong. Celia had been raised with the land as her teacher, every creek, every root, every moss-covered bank mapped in her memory. The bottomlands were extensions of her body and mind. She knew how to move silently, how to find dry ground where water threatened, and how to read the subtle signs that the men missed. The overseer's first hours in the swamp were marked by overconfidence. A few broken twigs, muddied footprints, and disturbed brush gave them the illusion of control. But those signs were carefully planted, patterns of misdirection designed to make them chase shadows. Every hour deeper into the swamp eroded their certainty, their authority crumbling as the forest taught its lessons. By the end of the first day, cracks began to show. Food packs were disturbed, though no one claimed responsibility. Paths they thought were clear led back to where they had started, and Jacob's carefully cultivated pride was pierced by the growing sense that they were being watched, studied, measured, and that the forest was silently conspiring with the girl they sought. These 5 men had believed themselves predators, masters of their plantation, masters of the enslaved. But in the Ojai bottomlands, knowledge mattered more than rifles, more than numbers. And for the first time they realized that brute force was meaningless against someone who understood the land better than they understood themselves. Next, we'll meet Celia herself, the girl who turned hunter into prey, the one who would reshape the swamp and rewrite what power truly meant. Boer. Among the enslaved on Gresham's plantation was a girl no one took seriously. Celia, 15 years old, quiet, observant, with a mind as sharp as the tool she could craft from scraps. She was small, yes, but the forest had raised her, taught her its secrets, and made her more dangerous than any overseer could imagine. Celia's mother had been Creek, her father African, and from them she inherited knowledge older than any plantation rule: how to read the land like a book, how to track animals, water and wind, how to vanish where others thought they could be seen. She had been preparing for the moment they would come for her, studying escape routes, hidden caches, safe paths through the bottomlands. The morning Samuel Yarrow summoned her, Celia did not flee at first. She walked calmly to the overseer's cabin, measured, deliberate, showing obedience, concealing her plan. And then, when she reached the tree line, she stepped into the dense green-like smoke, disappearing from their sight. The 5 men erupted behind her, rifles ready, voices loud, arrogance fueling their chase. Each step they took further into the swamp gave Celia the advantage. She knew every creek, every pit of mud, every snapping branch. The swamp itself became her ally, twisting paths, swallowing their sounds, hiding her movements. At first, the overseers believed they could control the hunt. Jacob Yarrow explained each footprint, each broken branch, smugly believing it showed their dominance. But slowly, unease crept in. The trail twisted unnaturally, footprints overlapping. Signs carved into trees hinted at intelligence beyond simple survival. Celia wasn't running. She was leading, testing the men, manipulating the swamp to her advantage, stealing portions of food while leaving subtle messages, moving among them without being seen. Her knowledge of the land turned every attempt at pursuit into a lesson in humility for the men who had thought themselves masters. By the second day, it became undeniable. The swamp had become a maze of her making, their confidence shattered, their weapons useless, and Celia remained invisible, a force moving through the shadows, observing, studying, choosing when and how to show herself. Her understanding of the land wasn't just survival, it was strategy. Every creek, every tree, every hollow she used as a tool against the men. She manipulated their fears, exploiting their arrogance. The forest became a classroom, and the overseers, the students failing every test. Celia represented a power they could not grasp. Not brute force, not numbers, not rifles, only knowledge, patience, and respect for the land. She taught the swamp's rules, the way it punished the careless and the cruel, and she did so without spilling a drop of her own blood. As the day ended and shadows lengthened, one truth became clear. Celia wasn't just a girl running from 5 men. She was a master of her world, turning hunters into prey, rewriting the rules of power, and demonstrating that the land, when understood, belongs to those who respect it. Next, the hunt escalates, and the swamp begins to punish those who believed they could dominate it. The overseers are about to learn that in Celia's world, survival is earned, and arrogance is deadly. By leak. The moment the 5 overseers stepped into the bottomlands, the rules changed. What they believed was a simple hunt for a runaway girl turned into a trap of their own making. Celia didn't flee blindly. She guided them, shaped the swamp into a weapon, and made every step a lesson in humility. At first, the men noticed subtle signs: broken twigs, footprints in impossible directions, moss shifted in ways that suggested someone had been there moments before. Jacob Yarrow scoffed, insisting it was just luck. Samuel argued they were losing the trail. But deep down, each felt the unease creeping in, a prickling at the edge of reason. By the second day, it became impossible to ignore. Food stores were raided, but only partially, missing the most nourishing portions, leaving the rest intact. Ropes were cut into neat segments, rifle shells collected. Every action left a message. Celia was here, but not in the way they expected. She was teaching them, testing them, demonstrating control. The swamp itself seemed to conspire with her. Dry earth became treacherous mud, creeks shifted, landmarks vanished or appeared where they shouldn't. Each misstep punished arrogance and rewarded patience, the men argued, their discipline dissolving, their weapons useless against an enemy they couldn't see. By nightfall, the forest grew alive. Shadows shifted unnaturally, strange sounds echoed from all directions, and above the crackling fire, a knife suddenly appeared lodged in a tree beside Samuel, thrown with perfect precision. No human could have done it unnoticed. A clear message: the swamp, guided by Celia, allowed them to survive, not their guns. Fear began to dominate. William Tyson and Henry Burke spoke of being watched, stalked, and manipulated by the very forest around them. Jacob insisted on pressing forward, driven by pride, by the desperate need to maintain authority. But with every step, the land reshaped itself, every path bending back on itself, every creek looping impossibly. Celia's symbols grew more frequent, carvings in bark, lines and marks signaling her presence and mapping the men's errors. She didn't strike directly. She didn't need to. Exhaustion, hunger, confusion, and fear became their enemies. The forest itself became the executioner, and the overseers, untrained and arrogant, were its prey. By the 3rd day, the trap tightened. Men fell behind, bodies weakened by fever, mud, and despair. William Tyson sank into waist-deep mud, dragging the others with him. Nathaniel Cruz succumbed to exhaustion before anyone could save him. Samuel and Henry staggered, every movement punished by unseen obstacles. Jacob's pride kept him moving, but even he felt the grip of the swamp squeezing. Celia's mastery became undeniable. Every trail, every symbol, every rearranged item was a message. She controlled the hunt, dictated their movements, and decided who would live and who would perish. She had turned the bottomlands into a classroom of survival, where the students were failing spectacularly. By nightfall, the overseers no longer chased a girl. They ran from an invisible force, a mind and land intertwined, a power they could neither understand nor resist. The lesson was clear. Arrogance, cruelty, and brute force cannot triumph over knowledge, patience, and respect for the world you think you control. Celia's hunt wasn't a pursuit. It was a trap, a carefully orchestrated unraveling of 5 men who thought the swamp was theirs to command. And as the night closed in, one thing became terrifyingly clear. In her world, the hunted was never helpless, and the land always remembers. Honestly, the swamp does not forgive ignorance, and it does not need weapons to punish. By the fourth day, the remaining overseers were unraveling. Exhaustion, fever, and fear had become more lethal than any blade or bullet. Nathaniel Cruz was the first to fall, not struck down by Celia, but consumed by his own weakness. Fevered, disoriented, and trapped in a mire he couldn't navigate, he simply could not go on. His body gave out, sinking into the mud, while the others, too drained to do more than stare, understood that nature had chosen who would live. William Tyson's fate was equally cruel. His legs swollen and useless, the swamp pulled at him with a hunger that refused compromise. Every attempt to move deeper entangled him further, forcing his companions to struggle alongside him. It was slow, methodical punishment, a reminder that arrogance and brutality mean nothing against land you do not understand. Henry Burke, desperate and terrified, became obsessed with the sounds, the shadows, and the movements he could not explain. Whispers of unseen observers, the shifting forest, and the feeling of invisible eyes pressing down on him drove him to the edge of madness. He began muttering about the girl who could command the land, about a force that had no need for weapons. By now, Jacob Yarrow's pride was all that kept him moving. Every misstep, every twisted path, every rearranged symbol carved by Celia in trees or mud reminded him of his failures, yet even he could not prevent the inevitable. The swamp consumed men who were slow, foolish, or ignorant, and there was no appeal, no negotiation. The forest and Celia worked in tandem. She needed not to strike directly. Exhaustion, disease, and the unforgiving terrain did the work for her. Her marks, her traps, and her understanding of the bottomlands ensured that each step taken by the men brought them closer to ruin. By the fifth day, only a fraction of the original party remained. Samuel Yarrow crawled from a creek, face pale, body battered, mind broken. The swamp had spared him, but at a cost no man could endure. Every memory of the bottomlands would haunt him forever. Celia's power was clear. 4 men entered the swamp to chase a girl, confident in rifles, knives, and violence. Only one would crawl back, and even he was left scarred in body and soul, carrying scratches etched in cryptic patterns across his arms, a living record of the swamp's judgment. The lesson was stark. Brute force does not conquer wisdom. Cruelty does not overpower knowledge, and the land always remembers those who trespass arrogantly. The bottomlands had delivered their verdict without a single swing of a sword. The hunted had become the teacher, and the students were undone by their own failings. In those forgotten waters, in the shadowed trees and muddy channels, Celia's silent power reshaped the rules of survival. She showed that mastery of land, patience, and cunning are more deadly than any weapon, and the swamp itself became her accomplice, claiming the weak, humbling the arrogant, and preserving the legend of the girl who had outwitted 5 men who thought they owned the world around them. And so, when the men finally emerged, broken and diminished, the message was clear. Cruelty, privilege, and brute force cannot survive where knowledge and respect rule. The bottomlands had decided who would live and who would die, and they did it without shedding a single drop of blood themselves. But you. By the late afternoon of the 5th day, the swamp seemed alive in a way the overseers had never imagined. Every twisted root, every sinking patch of mud, every shadowed tree was no longer just terrain. It was a reminder of their misjudgment. Jacob, Samuel, and Henry staggered through the dense undergrowth, weary and broken, the silence of the forest pressing against them like a living weight. Their rifles were almost empty, supplies gone, and every step felt like punishment. Then they stumbled into a small clearing. A pond glimmered faintly in the dim light, filtering through moss-draped cypress. And there, standing on the far side, was Celia. Not running, not hiding, simply watching. Her clothes were smeared with mud, but her posture was calm, controlled, a predator at peace. In her hands, she held a bow, the arrow not quite drawn, a silent warning of precision and patience. Around her, meticulously laid out, were the men's missing items. Ropes coiled into snares, rifle parts carefully arranged, knives positioned deliberately. Everything they had relied on to assert dominance now rested behind her like trophies. She had outwitted them at every turn, controlling the swamp without lifting a hand in violence. The men's pride collapsed entirely. Jacob tried to assert authority, but his voice cracked and carried no weight. Samuel's anger wavered, leaving him paralyzed. Even Henry, exhausted and terrified, understood that survival now depended on surrendering to the lesson. Celia spoke, her voice calm but cutting through the tension. 4 entered. Some are dead already. One may leave to tell what happened. The rest, the swamp will finish. Henry bolted first, disappearing into the forest in a desperate bid for life. Samuel hesitated only moments before following, leaving Jacob alone. Alone with the girl who had dismantled 5 men without ever touching them. The swamp pressed close around him, the trees seeming to lean in, and for the first time, Jacob understood that he had not failed because of fear or fatigue alone. He had failed because he never understood what true power looked like. Celia lowered her bow slightly, as if granting permission. The clearing held a quiet authority, a silent declaration that knowledge, patience, and respect for the land outweigh strength, weapons, and cruelty. And as Jacob stumbled away, the forest swallowed him once more, leaving behind the girl who had forever changed the bottomlands and the legend of the one who could survive where men perished. Cool. When the last overseer stumbled from the swamp, broken and hollow-eyed, the story of what had occurred in the Ojai bottomlands began to spread. Henry Burke survived physically, but his mind never recovered. For weeks, he wandered the plantation, muttering about trees that moved, water that waited, and a girl whose footsteps left no sound. Symbols he scratched into dirt and bark whispered secrets older than the county itself. The plantation fell into slow decay. Gresham tried to restore order, to reclaim the authority that had been shattered, but his overseers were gone, his enslaved workers no longer afraid in the same way, and the land itself seemed to resist him. Cotton bales weighed less, fences required constant repair, and the smallest tasks stretched into endless chores. The bottomlands had exacted a price, quietly but relentlessly, proving that control could never exist where knowledge and respect were absent. Celia vanished from official records, labeled only as a runaway, but in whispered tales among the enslaved, she became a figure of myth, a girl who outsmarted 5 men, who understood the swamp as her mother once had, and who survived through wit, patience, and mastery of her environment. Some said she never left the bottomlands, guiding others who fled the plantations, teaching survival where cruelty once ruled. Historians dismissed the story as folklore, but the facts remained undeniable. 4 men entered the swamp and never returned. One survived, but he carried scars and memories that haunted him for life. The lesson endured. Sometimes the hunted is not helpless. Sometimes the land itself sides with the wise. And sometimes true power belongs not to those who claim ownership, but to those who understand.